All right. Well, thank you again for joining us. We'll kind of continue to allow people to, join us as we go here. But this is, again, the DC Oral History Collaborative's monthly coffee chat program. My name is Jasper Collier, and I'm the Oral History Project Manager for Humanities DC and the DC Oral History Collaborative. The DC Oral History Collaborative provides funding, training, and support to DC residents and organizations who are telling the stories of their neighborhoods and communities through oral history interviews. Each coffee chat highlights a project and explores both the stories documented and the team's process and approach to oral history. So we will begin today by hearing a presentation from our panel, and then we'll have a moderated discussion before opening things up to questions from the audience. Just a couple of things about the Zoom platform. I know all of us have used Zoom many times for different programs and meetings, but for the purposes of this program, if you have questions that you want to ask the panel, please do put those in the Q&A. But you can also feel free to use the chat throughout the program as well. So if you have comments or things to add to the conversation, please add those to the chat, because it's always great to hear throughout the program kind of how people react to different things, or if you have some insight that you want to share. So, please feel free to use both of those things throughout the program. This month, we're delighted to be joined by a panel of team members and narrators from the Anthology of Booty Oral History Project, conducted in 2019. It kind of seemed to me that this project has been around for a little while longer than it actually has. I think that I was talking to Darby earlier this week and saying that it began in 2017, but I think the pandemic years kind of messed up my, ordering of events and things like that. The project was actually done in 2019, supported by the DC Oral History Collaborative, but, carried out to an extremely high degree by the group of panelists that we have here today. I do also want to note before we get started that all of their full interviews are available in the DC Public Library's Dig DC collection. So hopefully after today's panel, you'll go to the DC Public Library and listen to some of those interviews in full. Before they introduce themselves, we actually want to start with a clip from one of their interviews. So Tracy, would you please cue that up for us?
A hula hoop and stuff. It was just like, and people would give you the space. Oh yeah, that's the hula. We're gonna go right here. Yeah. This is fine. And it was always a good time.
Yeah.
Always a good time. Even when I didn't host or DJ or anything, I still would come to the parties because it's a good time. So.
Did it feel like they were offering something that was really unique?
Yeah.
What was it about it that felt unique?
The uniqueness is that you had a place where anyone who felt like they might not feel comfortable somewhere else, they automatically knew they would feel comfortable there. And it's because they had already been putting that idea out there. They explained it on the back of on the flyer when they talked about why it's called Backdoor, because this is for the people who might not have had interest to the front, people who been outsiders in another venue. This is for you. So it already told you, and then when you came, and everybody was always so open and welcoming, seeing you, and you never had anybody who was like, I feel this person is unsafe for me, or I feel uncomfortable with that. You never had that issue there,
right. Right.
Because it was automatically known from the door. That's like, hey, if you feel like you might want to be a little bit intrusive on someone or with someone, you probably shouldn't, and if you can't control that, you probably shouldn't be here.
Right.
So, and I like that, because everybody should be able to go and have a good time without anyone hindering that process. That's how I always go back to that. No one.
So that was the incredible zombie / DJ zombie / Erica, one of our narrators and a longtime collaborator of ours. And many different projects in DC. My name is Darby Hickey / DJ Bent, and I'm a member of Anthology of Booty and have been DJing and involved in parties and nightlife going back to about probably 2002 in DC. DJing starting around 2004, actually. Most of that time I lived in Columbia Heights, and then I lived for some time in Mount Pleasant, and just recently have relocated to Brightwood Park, actually. And maybe that's about it for me for now, and I'll pass it on over to Natty Boom.
Good morning. Good morning. Thanks everyone for being here. You look so lovely. You look so lovely out there. Let's just say that. And my name is Ebony Dumas. I'm also known as DJ Natty Boom. And as Darby is, I'm also 1/5 of Anthology of Booty. So I was born and raised in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I first moved to DC in 2005 after finishing college. I came here with no job, but I knew that I enjoyed the nightlife here, and I saw myself reflected in many different parts of the city. And so that was a main thing that really drew me here. I was also excited to join the DC Kings drag troupe. And so that was another reason why I moved here. But once I did move here, I fell in love with the opportunity to create events and performances with friends who became my community. And after a couple of years of living here, that's when I met these lovely folks that you see on your screens. And we all became like really close friends and family. And so I guess I also wanted to highlight some of my earliest and closest connections with music were growing up in a Baptist church in Oklahoma. So my dad is a preacher, and even with his blessing, I love the connection between what he does as a preacher in front of a community, and also what I do and like what I channel when I'm DJing as well. In high school, I was also in our marching band, you know, like Beyonce homecoming style, not that other style. And I played the cymbals and the percussion section. And for me, that really solidified my connection, bridging performance with music. And thank you. Look forward to chatting more later.
Everybody does look beautiful. Good morning. My name is Kristy. I go by Kristy Lorat with throwing parties and DJing these days. And I am a local to the DMV, DC, Maryland, Virginia area. Grew up in Virginia, kind of sneaking into DC for musical and political events as a teenager. And then my whole adult life, I've lived in DC, except for a few years in Peru, which is where another place that I call home. I would say one of my favorite things about creating spaces when you throw parties is something I love also, to Natty Boom's point about classrooms. I'm a community educator. What I love about political actions is that you kind of weave worlds together. And that's been something that has been really exciting as a group of friends falling in love with each other, to be able to have these visions of worlds that we want to create, and even for a night or over longer periods of time and with others, we get to kind of create those. So I'd say that's how I'm coming into the work, about thinking about shaping spaces collectively. And I would say that a lot of my work is influenced by living in a transnational family. A lot of like tapes and connecting over music with my family in Peru has been really influential to me. Got to be 1/5 of Anthology of Booty in the founding group. Also worked with the Maracuya Collective, and most recently with the elders on their block and creating block parties during the pandemic. I'll pass it to Summer.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. This is pretty exciting. I love oral histories. So feel very happy to be part of this. I am Slammer. Also go by DJ Mothersheister. And I've lived in DC since 2003. And I moved here because I basically wanted to be in a city that was majority Black and queer. And one day there was I forgot why I was visiting, but I was in the subway and I saw these two young, like teenage girls making out, and they looked so free and so happy. And I realized, like, this is where I want to be. I want to be in a space where like two Black femmes can just like enjoy each other's presence and feel loved. Um and yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I chose DC, and it became my home. And one of the many reasons that I call it home is because as a person who came into DC, to be a journalist. Like I started as a reporter, working in the community radio space. I realized that part of community radio and part of my organizing was so rooted in family building. And for me, DC is home because of the people that I am connected to and see as family. And luckily, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but I joined this community radio station called Radio CPR. And from there, just started seeing music and like party organizing as a form of storytelling. And that's how I connected with so many of the folks that are in this space. And yeah, I feel like we are like I can't even think of the best word for it, but just like we are representative of just so many different moments in DC in terms of like the anti-war movement, like the movement against sexual harassment. My idea of safety and security came from our party organizing. So I'm in tech. I do a lot of security work around tech. And I always go back to our parties and reference and say, hey, the only reason that I am able to understand harm reduction is through our organizing together. So yeah, I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but also I wanted to see if Tracy can cue us up with the clip from Ebony about the formation of Anthology of Booty.
So the DC hot commodities.
Okay. Okay.
I think there are even airbrushed T-shirts.
Beautiful. That makes sense. Okay, so they were part of this loose collective, but then you started to become friends with them.
Mm-hmm.
And then what were the steps toward becoming a DJ collective?
You're right. So we were visiting in Baltimore, and this was like one of the first times we had like made a trip together. And I remember the next morning just like sitting around a table having brunch at a friend's house, and like starting to share a lot more about music in the way that we eventually started to what formed and solidified our relationship was like sharing music. And so that was a really like beautiful time where I was able to talk about like my experience growing up in church and how some of the similarities between music I grew up in church and gospel, and with like I don't know, even like Baltimore club music or go-go and other like genres that I was playing at the time, with call and response or just like the syncopation, and then people were sharing about like different musical styles that were from their cultures and backgrounds. And so that was like one of the first times I was like, whoa, I think this is a good thing. This is like getting to be something bigger. So that was a nice experience. And then I had my show on Radio CPR was right before Kristy and Natasha's show. And so their show was called Late Night Confessions, and mine was doing it in the park. And so we had like an hour like overlap, and this one time, and decided to talk about some late night confessions, but also, our biography of dance, our, autobiography of the dance floor, of the anatomy of the song, and then like Anthology of Booty, and so it was like one of those like word plays that we were throwing back and forth that kind of I believe resulted in Anthology of Booty, but other people might have a different stories.
All right.
So you're up, Slammer. And then I think we wanted to show the images now, Natty Boom.
Awesome. So I will talk a little bit about sorry, I just want to make sure to look at my notes because there's so much that I could say about our party. Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about Backdoor. And the first Backdoor was in August 2009 at the 930 Club. And for folks who haven't been to that space, the back door is basically in the 930 Club's basement. And it's normally called, that space is called Back Bar, which mostly, as far as I know, and folks can chime in, function as a space that folks that went to, go to 930 would go, to the Back Bar, like after concerts ended or in between concerts. And the entrance is on the side of the 930 Club, which is one of the reasons why I love this flyer, because it's kind of like representative a little bit in terms visually of where it's located. And when you walk down, you have to walk down these stairs, and the space is similar to sort of a rail car. The bar is on the right and the dance floor is pretty narrow. The DJ booth is in the very back part of the back bar, and it's next to a set of stairs that leads to the 930 Club concert space. And Backdoor, I was going through our emails, like our organizing emails, and I sometimes forget like how creative we are as a group, like in terms of our communication around our parties. And reading the emails, I was just like, where is my creativity right now? Because if you look at the flyers and if you read the like our post to our email post, we set some amazing ways of thematically talking about the party and the space that we wanted to create. So some things that I could think of is like, we had a party that was called Local Love, which was all about DC Pride. And it was a monthly party, just to let folks know. And yeah, so like, and that party had, we focused on playing a lot of DC native music, some go-go, music that focused on DC artists. We had a party called Booty Bandits by Pirates and Beyonce. You could just imagine what that party was like. We had a party called Backdoor to the Future, which is our ode to all things sci-fi. And at the time, I don't think we used the word speculative fiction, but I would say like we were like reimagining what it meant to like have this kind of party in the future. So like, I start with Backdoor, but also, we DJ'd as a collective, Anthology of Booty, in various places, various venues, including U Street Music Hall, where we had this party called The Basement, Laro in Columbia Heights. We had a Backdoor Carnival themed party called Farewell to the Flesh. And we also loved partying at, like, we loved throwing parties and collaborating in houses. So there was a party called Homoween at the Hot Tub House, because I wonder if it's still the case here, but there were so many houses that had names, like group houses that had names, and this house was called the Hot Tub House, and we threw a queer Halloween party there. And we took our parties as a collective, even outside of DC. So we, partied in lots of different places in the country, including the Allied Media Conference, which is an amazing conference that happens in Detroit that focuses on radical organizing. And so, yeah, we did that. And like RAT had organized this amazing sort of like TED, I would call it, I guess the equivalent would be like a TED Talk, which is sad to say, of music called DJ Geek Out, because it was beyond what you would consider a TED Talk to be. And it was just super fun. And now we do this, annual party called Booty Rex. That's a pride party, and Booty Rex actually started, if I'm wrong, please tell me, y'all, at Chief Ike's with the She Rex crew. And then eventually we moved to the annual party. We moved it to an annual party at the Black Cat, which is currently happening, except COVID happened, so we didn't do it last year or this year. But that's our legacy, Booty Rex. And I'll just hand it off to talk about some of the goals of our DJing and parties.
Yeah, so when we started Anthology of Booty and Backdoor, which was our inaugural flagship party, our goal was always, as Erica had so eloquently described earlier in the clip from her interview, was to have a lot of fun. And that means that the space needs to be inviting and safe in a way for people. A party can't be the best party ever. It can't be the most fun if people have to worry about if they'll be groped or misgendered or have someone ask if they could touch their hair. And so we had a lot of conversations with the first venue, with a 930 Club Back Bar, and then later with other venues where we went, about things like sexual harassment or assault, how we would respond, safe bathroom access for transgender or gender nonconforming people. I remember kind of blowing someone's mind at a venue when we brought that up when they were showing us their new space, and they were like, oh, we didn't even think about that. Talking about racial and gender diversity and performer lineups. And kind of a lot of these conversations that we were having at this time, like 2009, 2010, have since really ripened into kind of national or even beyond national, global social conversations, whether it's Me Too, talking about, Oscars So White or what have you. And it feels, looking back in a way, as if we were, along with many, many other people, maybe a little ahead of our time, and also trying to push the conversation and push what was possible and make what we had in our imaginations into reality. And so we worked a lot on creating inclusive and empowered dance floors. We saw the dance floor as fundamentally political and social spaces as a political act always, whether people wanted them to be or not. People would always say to us, some DJs or party promoters or club owners, well, why you gotta be so serious? Why you wanna make it about, this politics? And it's like, actually, that's part of having the fun is understanding this dynamic that we exist in, whether you wanna recognize it or not. This is a dynamic that's going on, and what our party spaces look like, what our social spaces look like, who's able to access them, who's able to feel good in them, totally informs the broader society. You can think and dance, as Nina says, exactly right. Another thing that we tried to do with our efforts, both before and with Anthology of Booty and Backdoor, was to to bring different kinds of music that came from our own backgrounds or from places we had lived or communities we felt affinity to. And in that way, we were bringing some music into party spaces that wasn't common around DC. And we also were rejecting kind of an approach that we saw among some DJs or some art, record companies of kind of being colonizers of music and saying, oh, this is the hot new music this week. And oh, that music style is not cool anymore. We're not playing that. But instead to present it and expose people to different music from different parts of the country, of the world, different communities, and contextualize it and talk about what it meant and what it meant to communities. And people, when they would hear it on the dance floor and it spoke to them, would be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you're playing this. I never hear this played. And that was a very powerful moment that we would really enjoy creating. And we really wanted to push back on some of the ways that we saw other people bringing music into spaces. And we also wanted to, kind of reclaim in a way and recontextualize songs like Back That Ass Up, which we talked about in an interview we did with a city paper, and how as a group of women playing music and creating this certain kind of space centered on consent and centered on respect, that we could also dance and enjoy kind of music that might not be thought of in that same way and in that same vein, and we could change what it meant. So we talked a lot about consent and safety and respect when we composed our party invites. We would work with some kind of more straight or mainstream venues. This was an important thing because a lot of places were closing. A whole neighborhood of LGBT/gay clubs and bars was obliterated in the early 2000s to make way for Nationals Ballpark. And so we wanted to also break out of some binaries around what is a queer space, or what is a people of color space, or what is a women's space, and mix up some of those ideas and identities in ways that were positive and felt productive. And so we would go to like the 930 Club or to some other places where we played. And then what that meant was doing some of the work with them to talk about, okay, what does it mean to have different kinds of people in your club that you don't usually have? And then we would also work with mom and pop businesses and owned by immigrants and people of color for mutual benefit. And we would lead DJ workshops to positively change and diversify the cultural landscape of DC performers. And in all these ways, both trying to create the space that we wanted to be in and that we wanted to see and invite others to be in, as well as have a ripple effect on the broader society, from the microcosm of nightlife and social spaces to society in general. And those are some of our goals, which were informed by where we came from. And now Rat is going to speak a little bit on our history before Anthology of Booty.
Yes, thank you. Well, as been mentioned, like friendship and relationships has always been at the center of our work together. And part of that has been, coming together in informal ways, but sometimes coming together through formal ways has also been something where we learned and grew and bonded together. So some of the previous configurations that we existed as Anthology of Booty is many of us were involved in Radio CPR, which was a community radio station based in DC for more than 20 years, a hyper-local station that was established to meet the needs of the community, amazing history, which we will talk on. We were DJs, lead organizers, event planners for Radio CPR together. And Natty Boom told a story about that in studio time and how connection happened there. And then we were doing it on a larger scale with lots of DJs across the city as well. We also worked in other formations like Girls Rock DC as coaches and lead organizers, Insight DC, Women of Color Against Violence, the DC Radio Co-op, did a lot of independent media, from everything from indie media, if anybody remembers indie media, to like local reporting in some of the newspapers that exist in DC now still, and some that don't. And like previous formations such as the Hot Commodities was like a collective that then morphed. I don't see a shout out to Ryan in the chat, who was a part of that. DJ Radius presente. And before we began throwing parties together, we also did DJ slots at B-Bar, which allowed us to kind of both socialize, also perform, and also like kind of see what it was like to have a whole night where a few of us were the main DJs and then others were supporting each other. I'd say in terms of our past together house parties gave us the opportunity to really step into every role as an organizer. Many of us lived in group houses. It was a major part of our lives and like a culture. And a lot of times the projects that I just mentioned had no like official budget. And so we were mainly throwing house parties to support these projects. Radio CPR being one prime example where we would set out to raise like the $3,000 we needed for the year with like a huge 300 or 400 person party at someone's house, wherever we could do it. Global Beach Party, yes, that was one of the famous ones. And that gave us a chance to obviously like raise money was the goal, but we would pull together a team of like 20 volunteers and be in charge of everything from the invite, with which Slammer mentioned, like all that went into an invite, to figuring out safety and mutual respect, making room for expression for people who were coming, making a space that felt welcoming to us and to our friends. We made drink concoctions at home and had to figure out safety with that. We made connections with the neighbors to make sure everything felt good on the block, and also trying to avoid policing and harassment, bathroom setups, rides afterwards, food to soak up the alcohol, water everywhere. And so when we moved to a club, there were lots of things where we really knew our preferences because of these house parties that we were throwing on a grassroots basis, but that helped us like really figure out, I think, some of what then like safer spaces meant for us when we moved into more formal establishments. And the last thing I wanted to say is just like in terms of friendship, yes, Everclear Jello shots may or may not have been a part of that, was just that there was a lot of bike riding, dancing with each other at other parties or showing up to see what was up with the party, growing into chosen fam together, but also like some of that happened by helping each other find safety and joy. And those can happen in like public and private. I think search for expression was something that was a big thread, and then weaving like our own visions instead of reacting, maybe like weaving our visions into existence is something that brought us together a lot before official forming of Anthology of Booty. So I will pass it on. And thank you.
All right. So we also wanted to take a moment to describe the goals of the Oral History Project. And so when we first accepted the invitation to speak today, we went back to our original application materials and just asked ourselves, you know, like, did we do the things that we said we were going to do? I'll let you be the judge of that, but I did want to give us a quote from our application materials. And so what we listed as our goals was, we seek to document the dynamic shifts in DC's social spaces from the mid-2000s to the present, focusing on nightclubs, bars, dance halls, and house parties by gathering first-person oral histories of Anthology of Booty, the project leadership, an all-women DJ collective, and the communities we serve. We seek to illuminate the collective's strategies for creating unique and welcome social spaces against the backdrop of changes in the city. So wow, that's a lot. But we felt we could easily shape our oral histories to specifically speak to these items. However, when we were awarded the grant, we attended the required workshops, which were required to teach the grantees about oral histories and how to collect them. So in those workshops and classes, we learned that oral histories were unlike a lot of the journalism and interviewing we had done before. Oral histories are really about an individual story. So we weren't really, you know, not all of us were expecting to like talk about our childhoods or really even talk about our lives outside of DC. But once we learned the goals of an oral history and the parameters of an oral history, we opened up a lot more to include that into our oral histories. However, once we did start talking about these things and like we, spoke on a very personal level, we did start to see, all the themes that we had hoped to accomplish in our oral history project. We start to see those themes emerge kind of organically and naturally. And so some of the themes that we saw were, exploring how historical patterns of segregation played out in nightlife spaces. And so definitely including house parties, which neighborhoods we were having house parties, and what years, and what the in and out migration was looking like in those neighborhoods at the time. Which communities were we getting the cops called on us more? So, also thinking about bars and like which bars had things like dress codes that were, in my personal opinion, offensive. Nightclubs where, thinking about how much drinks were costing, how much it would cost for us to be able to play there. And I think another thing that was really interesting is at a certain time when there was a lot of change in the city, there were even clubs that that wouldn't give our patrons water for free. And so people are there paying, a cover, they're buying alcohol. And, we had a issue where the club was like only giving out these big A bottles of like Voss, those glass bottles of water. They were like $7. And so we had a very serious chat with the management after that. And so when we are telling these stories, we really start to see, issues around race and class, sexual orientation, gender identity. And then we also saw like a common theme of, we're exploring in turn, how do we ask how spaces are considered safe or not? And how has this shifted as DC has changed? And so I think that will round out our presentation segment. And I'll turn it back over to Jasper as we end on this lovely first flyer for a backdoor. Amen.
That was great. Thank you all so much for giving us some background and context, a lot of background and context, actually. And I think that, a lot of the themes that, you brought up in this initial presentation, things that are intersecting each other, like your work in activism, your coming together as friends, your focus on making people, feel comfortable, safe, and secure at these, shows that you were playing, at these parties that you were throwing. They're all things that I'm hoping that we can explore a little bit more, as we kind of go into the moderated discussion part of this. But, I also do want to kind of, for all of these oral history coffee chats, one of the things that we try to do is we try to have a kind of a balance of questions between talking about, the stories that came out of the oral history project that you did, but also trying to talk a little bit about that process. And so, Ebony, I really appreciate the fact that towards the, end of the presentation, you were focusing on kind of, what you all were thinking about when you, first started thinking about, we want to do this oral history project. Maybe we want to apply for this grant with the DC Oral History Collaborative. Because, one of the things that we hope happens by doing these coffee chats and highlighting all the really great work that the past cohorts have done, so we're hoping that we can encourage more people to, tell their stories through oral history, and more people to kind of contribute to that archive, so we can kind of continue to build the resource and, help people get their stories told. I think that you all, Ebony, especially, you talked quite a bit about kind of what drove that decision to start the project. And I think that it was great that you pulled out that quote where, you talked about some of your initial goals, when you got started. And I know that you said that we could be the judge as to whether or not those goals were accomplished, but I just wondered if having kind of gone back and, probably reviewing these transcripts, listening to each other's oral history interviews, what do you feel about that? Do you feel like, you were able to kind of, hit some of those points, or, do you feel like, do you feel like you accomplished those goals that you laid out in the application?
I do. I think we, hit a lot of the topics that we, because when we're writing the application, we are kind of having more of an academic discussion. We are, all kind of like overly educated, folks in our crew. And so we're really like digging deep on themes. And when we started to see, okay, well, how did me growing up in Oklahoma, how did another person growing up in Texas, how did that influence how we saw DC? How did that, the racial dynamics in DC, how are they different from other places that we had lived or visited before? And so a lot of the themes just kind of like really came up organically. And so I don't know if anyone else wanted to touch a little bit on that, but I think we hit it on the nail, or the nail on the head.
Yeah, and I would say that, like, for me, having read through much of your transcripts, and especially like having kind of re-immersed myself in them over the last few weeks as we were kind of putting this program together, I fully agree with that. In fact, like, I think that this is kind of another example for me where oral history, kind of it starts out, it's a little bit different, I think, in that you all kind of did have these kind of larger goals for the project. But a lot of times in oral history, people will have this idea that they want to tell this story of their particular community, or this very kind of like insular story. But then, as the interviews actually are recorded and people start kind of recounting kind of from, their origins to where they are now and how they got involved with that community, like so many more stories do come out of it, or so many more kind of threads or intersectional topics come out of it. And I do think that the kind of collective story that you all told does have a lot to say about overall developments across the city that took place between when you all started back in 2009. Am I correct? And that's when you all first came together as Anthology of Booty. I know you all were kind of working together quite a bit before that, but between then and now, I think that there's been so much change in everything, and I think that that's really captured. And you can kind of like feel yourself in it as you're listening or reading through the transcripts of your oral history. So, yeah, I mean, for my part, I definitely think that your oral history project, and I hope that many more people will go to listen to them, now that they're archived and available in the DC Public Library, really kind of captures that story and can be a really great resource for people kind of seeking to understand that. Talking a little bit about the interview experience, kind of itself. And, I think that it was great that you kind of point out that you all, many of you do have this journalism background. So there was kind of this, change in thinking about like what the interview process might look like as well, to this kind of more life history, this broader interpretation of what an interview is. Did you all have any hesitations kind of as you started to move towards that, in terms of like feeling comfortable sharing your full life story, or kind of being more open about that than you might have originally thought you were going to? And if you did, kind of what was there any process or technique used to kind of help everybody feel a little bit more comfortable with that?
I can start out. I was hesitant in participating. And I actually will say that I even became a little bit more hesitant once we went to the workshops, because I didn't have an understanding that the oral history project process does include putting centering your story. And that was very hard, because there's a lot of things that, like, I was afraid that could come up, that could bring out some trauma that I am still like healing from, like thinking through your childhood till now. And so when I realized that could be part of the process, and I could share as much as I wanted to. So I understood that I had agency around that, but it did give me some pause. to realize like I needed to center myself, especially since I don't really like, first of all, I don't like hearing my voice. And then when I think about, talking, like, the importance that I saw in centering myself was that how could I talk about Anthology of Booty without talking about my entire history, or as much, or those parts of myself that really brought me to this place where we formed this group together and informed our approach to organizing, building family together, supporting our communities. And so, yeah, that was definitely part of that process. And then I think, I don't remember, we had so many conversations as a group. And so that definitely helped in terms of like alleviating some doubts or like fears. But also part of those conversations was, the act of remembering. And the act of remembering was like thinking about all the amazing moments that we've had at our parties, including like having hula hoopers, well, myself too, but like I was hula hooping through, like at our backdoor parties in the 930 club, or back bar space, which is super small. And like dancing, on the stairwell, and having amazing guests who, Kieran, who is based in LA, but lived in DC, amazing drummer, performer, having the slew of other DJ guests that came in, all the amazing romances that we saw form on the dance floor, the amazing, like, I mean, the 930 Club really gave us like a lot of leeway in terms of the party. And so having those memories, as well as the fact that we were so intentional about our organizing, and we really wanted to like inject joy and in the entire process. And if it didn't become joyful, then we needed to figure out a way of changing it up. Like, that's why we came together. And there's like this Emma Goldman quote that people always bring up, like the anarchist, like, if I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution. And I definitely see that as like always, like has led me in this whole, in my entire life, that, what, like how joyful or how lucky am I that I can support all these different communities, like HIPS in terms of their organizing, Radio CPR, all these different, groups that are trying to build the world that we want to live in, through me just throwing a party and having the chance to dance with my friends and grind on the dance floor and like be able to do things with my body that I didn't think I could do. So yeah.
That's so beautiful. I love what you said about the act of remembering, as like so important to this process. I wanted to add on with things that motivate us initially to do the project, and so that was like balancing out some of the hesitancy that I think we definitely all felt. One was like being in a time of reflection, so moving from doing like monthly parties to just focusing on a yearly Pride party. Booty Rex, shout out to Booty Rex, gave us more room and space to be in a reflection mode, and like a retrospective project felt more possible and exciting. Also, all of us have been out of town for extended periods of time during the formation, during the time that our collective has been together. And this is a time when 4 out of 5 of us were in town. Huge shout out to Natasha, DJ In Denial, formerly known as DJ Trash, formerly known as DJ Food, who was the only member who was out of town, so didn't work primarily on this, but being able to have like 4 out of 5 of us in town was also an opportunity in this one moment. Wishing for more storytelling that we could have had by some of the folks who influenced and mentored us was something else that was a huge motivating factor, and hearing from others about what had been influential to them. And then also like a huge investment, as has been said, in the importance of storytelling, documentation, and public archives. And shaping those felt like a really interesting opportunity.
Great. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. And also, I do want to point out, thank you, Darby, for putting the link to the oral history collection in the chat. So that is, definitely there for everybody. But I want to pick up actually on, what both Slammer and Kristy have said here about like, thinking about like not only kind of the communities that were supported, but also the influences that kind of brought you all together and, really influenced you and everything that you were doing. Can you like talk a little bit more? And I know we talked about this a little bit in the presentation, but can you tell us a little bit more about, be it kind of the organizations that you all were kind of working, together at or together with prior to forming Anthology of Booty, or some of the causes that kind of brought you all together? And then I think like, if possible, kind of like, also like if you have anything to kind of talk about in terms of like, now that you all have kind of put this in the archive and you put your stories out there, are there any kind of, current organizations or current kind of up and coming, possibly other, groups or DJ collectives or even kind of activist causes that you're hoping your story can then kind of go on to influence? I know it's kind of a big question, but hopefully, hopefully it was, legible to some degree.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the most remarkable things about revisiting this and preparing for this talk is that we talk so much about radio CPR, and it played such an important role in our development as individuals, as a group, and it's something that does not exist anymore, as as many projects and many efforts are. They're ephemeral, right? They are here, they make an impact, and then they're gone, and their impact lasts, right? Their impact stays and keeps reverberating, but people don't always know about it, and they don't always know where things came from. And so I think this is one of the great lessons to me of our process with and of oral history projects, and why everyone should do one, is it's capturing these amazing stories that get lost otherwise. Not lost, but it's capturing them in a different way. And so radio CPR was this really phenomenal, very low power, community-based radio station based out of Mount Pleasant for approximately, I think it was about 20 years, that we all were involved in. We all did shows on, we all helped to run in different ways, and we helped to support through these house parties and through organizing. And it was started as a response to welfare reform and anti-immigrant sentiment in the late 90s, and wanting to support people in the neighborhood, and also in response to media consolidation and the idea that you could only hear certain things on the radio, and certain views and certain sounds and voices and musics you couldn't hear on the radio. And so it was a really important thing that I hope that someday there will also be an oral history project of as well. I think some of the other important ones we talked about were some of our earlier DJ formations, and we talk about those in our interviews, which is great fun to listen to. Kristy mentioned Insight, Women of Color Against Violence, did a lot of great work in DC around street harassment and challenging ideas of what safety is and who keeps you safe, that informed our work, and that I think informs the entire context that we're in today in conversations about policing. And as Ebony mentioned, the DC Kings, I think I loved listening back to Ebony's interview and talking about going to see the DC Kings perform at Chaos, which was a literally underground club, not figuratively, just literally. It was down in the basement in DuPont Circle on 17th Street. And I remember going there as a very young person in DC, and it was such a great space, and it's gone, right? And Ebony talks about Phase One, another club that was in Capitol Hill, and it's gone. And so many of these places are gone. The DC Kings, I don't know if they continue to exist to this day, but certainly, no, they don't. But there are, again, the reverberations continue. And so I think that's something really phenomenal about kind of reviewing the project. And once again, what my pitch is always to everyone to do an oral history project of some sort. I wondered if, I believe DJ Zombie is here, and she spoke some in her interview about radio CPR as well, and about the importance of the show she did there. She was also involved there. I wondered if she might want to talk a little about her experience of being interviewed, or her reflections on radio CPR, or anything. And if you're not feeling it, that's fine too. Oh, great. I think you're unmuted, and go ahead.
Okay, so could you repeat the question maybe?
Yeah, just what was your experience like being interviewed for the project, the Oral History Project, and also if you have any reflections on radio CPR?
Okay, yeah. My feelings on being interviewed were one of like surprise one, because me, I just feel like I'm just a participant, a happy patron of sorts, even though I've done like hosting, and I've been on the decks, at certain parties. So, I mean, even though I felt like I've contributed with the scene, I feel like I'm just a little small, tiny little speck. So the fact that anyone wanted to talk to me about what I thought, it was like, oh, fantastic. Me, little old me. But like I was saying, as far as like radio CPR is concerned, like I was saying in the chat, I purposely, one, because I'm proud of what radio CPR was doing and was able to do while it did exist. Even though when I got the opportunity to participate, I had no idea what I was getting into. I almost thought that I was like, I'm going to jail, I think. And I'm not really sure why I volunteered to do this. But once I really got what the whole purpose of radio CPR being in existence was for, I was totally on board, because I was like, you know what? Yeah, the man needs to know that, the quote unquote man needs to know that there are voices out here that need to be heard, and there are voices out here that need their stories to be told, and they need their, even their entertainment to come to them, And so I, like I was saying, I wear my radio CPR shirts all the time, and people are always like, radio CPR, what's that? And it's almost like that button that people wear at stores where they want you to ask them about the deals. I'm like, oh, I'm glad you asked. So radio CPR started out because people needed to have a voice. You know how radio is. The radio doesn't always cater to everybody. It caters to what the agenda wants you to hear or what they want to promote. And there were voices and communities out there that were not represented on the radio airwaves. So a group of people decided, hey, let's try to get that information to them. They tried to do it legitimately, and that didn't work. So they were like, well, I think you have some space there that you're not using that you don't know about. So we're just going to take it. Hey, we tried to do it the nice way, but this has to be done. And it stayed around for a long time. I did Go-Go on there. I inherited that show from another friend of mine, as they were they were embarking on a new endeavor. And so they kind of were like, you'd be great to take over my show. And I was like, I guess. And then it became my thing, to this day, it's still my thing. I still kind of revive it in different incarnations within some of my DJ sets, or DJ programs that I might do on live or Twitch or something like that. I involve that show. I'm like, hey, this is it's a movement, because especially me being a go-go DJ, and that being, of course, the most recently proclaimed music of DC, it wasn't always put out that way. There are a lot of people who are even in DC who who've been around DC and Maryland and Virginia areas, the areas where you would be likely to hear it, and they don't know about it or they never heard, you know? So I felt it was my duty to give you a piece of yourself every Wednesday for 2 hours, you know? And I believe that for me, Radio CPR is like, it was part of a movement. It was not just about the music for me. For me, even though I was mostly just a music and entertainment show, it was great, but I also appreciated the variety of all types of other shows. I tell people they had shows about tenants' rights, you know, they had shows about the LGBT community that took on the issues when violence was happening in that community in the city and no one was talking about it, you know. All sorts of things that you would never hear on regular radio. Even some of our public affairs radios wouldn't touch some of those topics, you know? So it was necessary. It needed to happen. And when we do our live showcases to raise money for the community or to support, you know, running the radio station, and people would come out and find out and discover that this was happening, it was like you see a light go on in their eyes, like, what? There's somebody out here who supports the community, that the small community that I'm in, that no one else pays attention to. Great, you know? So, and relating to the bigger picture of this, Anthology of Booty has always been a community of people who has been bringing these communities to the forefront and saying, hey, you do have a voice and you do have a space. There is a space for you, and we want to give that to you, or we want to try to give that to you at least, you know, in any endeavor that they've been in, whether it's on the party scene, whether it's on the activist scene, it's, you know, whether it's on, you know, traveling to Detroit to do conventions and educate people on, you know, lost forms of the art and how that intertwines with activism. You know, all of my interactions with the people of Anthology of Booty and their efforts and programs and parties and all the things they've done have kind of brought me around to like a full circle individual as I guess an entertainer, you know, a DJ or a host, you know, because it's different when you're really trying to reach your people and you're not just saying, hey, watch me do this, you know. So the impact of Anthology of Booty is awesome, and anytime I get a chance to talk about that or talk about Radio CPR or talk about Booty Rex or talk about AMC, you know, Allied Media Conventions and stuff like that, it's always so enlightening for whoever I'm talking to, because they're always like, wow, you know, sometimes they're like, oh yeah, I've heard of things. And sometimes they're like, they had no idea, but they're glad that it's happening, you know, or glad that it happened. So that's my little spiel on that, you know. And I remember in my interview just talking about the change in how culture is, how that culture is perceived now versus, I'll say, 20 years ago. So I talked a lot about that. I was like, you know, back in the day, you would never hear go-go song in the middle of the day. It was too much for the masses to take. They gotta wait till like after the 5 o'clock rush home. It's just too hype. We can't play that at 1 p.m., you know? And now they've come a little bit closer to accepting, hey, sometimes we got to get hyped a little bit, you know? Sometimes, because the people want it. And I'm glad that that's happening. And I would like to say that groups like Anthology of Booty are what have helped push that movement further into the mainstream so that people are more accepting or more willing to accept or willing to acknowledge and make room for these communities who need to be heard and need to have a space.
Well, I would say you also are responsible for that as well, DJ Zombie, of you know, being so long standing and being on the air. And I love in your interview you talk about, and everyone should go and listen to Erica's interview. It's amazing.
Thank you.
Talking about the first time you DJ, and it really is an incredible kind of visual description of the house party and of the reaction to Zombie's DJ set. But I'll just leave it at that, so you can go and listen to the interview. I'll throw in the link again here in a minute.
That's awesome.
Thank you so much, Zombie. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you. And actually, thank you so much. And Zombie, if you actually want to stay with us, I have a few more questions, but I want to make sure that we, leave some time here because we have a, very active audience, and I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for people to ask questions. I know there are going to be some good questions. So can we go ahead and open things up to the audience? If you have a question that you want to type in, please do type it in the Q&A so that we can keep track of them. If you would like to say your question, just go ahead and use the raise hand feature. I think everybody should have that at the bottom of their screen. And Tracy can unmute you so that you can just ask your question directly to the panel. Thanks.
So we did have a question earlier from Oscar, and he asked, how has DC changed since 2009? How has it not changed? And what influence has the surrounding area, Maryland and Virginia, made to that?
I think I can start off with a couple of items, and I say this also as someone who, in the past year and a half, needed to leave DC and come to live in PG County. And so, I think that kind of change in DC, how has DC changed? In 2009, I could find a more affordable place to live. And I felt like, my wife and I wanting to stay in DC, but needing a little bit more space. And fortunately, when we had a little bit more space, then it was pandemic hit, and we were actually able to, have some workspaces. And so that kind of change from 2009 or even 2015, 2018, those changes in availability of housing, where affordable housing is located, which neighborhoods. I think for me, just kind of on a personal level, where it's impacting my life on a day-to-day basis. I still have most of my friends and close chosen family are in DC. But even I've noticed they've kind of had to move away from, a lot of times. When I first moved to DC, I lived in Shaw. I lived at 9th and P Northwest. Then, a couple years later, I moved down to 1st and O Northwest. And then after that, it was almost all in Northeast until, coming to PG County. But even seeing my friends kind of do a similar migration farther and farther away from the center of the city, farther from Columbia Heights, from Mount Pleasant, from those areas where we used to feel really connected to. That's what I've seen and experienced.
Yeah, I can add to that. I think that it's harder to find venues to do anything. And then when I say venue, I'm thinking of a diversity of venues, house parties. Maybe I'm just not clued in, but I used to know, there would be a house party, at least a couple of house parties every week. And if you know of house parties, whoever is listening to this, please, you can contact us on Facebook. We're on Instagram, I think, but some of us are, and let us know as soon as possible, because I would love to go to those parties. But, I could definitely see our parties would end earlier, and because cops would be called, like there were more warehouse spaces to be able to throw a party in, and those are just harder to find, or they, closed down. And then there's a certain kind of risk that you take in by, throwing parties in places that are not traditionally seen as party spaces. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to go in venues that have the capacity to host like nightlife, because of some of those risks, including like, we don't want to deal with cops all the time. There was also a capacity issue. As we know, there's been places around the country where like there have been buildings that were not up to code, and they were hosting parties. And like we lived in a house, the Palace, where like basically I would see the house like the floor would be rippling as if there was like an earthquake, because we had so many people in that space. And so, we assumed the role as like the fire inspector / whatever building code inspector. And I'd just be staring at the floors being like, we got to get people out of this basement, or like just worrying, So there's like a lot of, I wish there was just more, I wish the city would not sell this idea of nightlife and sell this like, all these amazing cultures that really bring a lot of love to DC, without giving us like the support and like the ability to host the kinds of events that are, probably like put on the DC, website or whatever, saying that we're like, yeah, I don't know. But I wish there was more support around that. So that's something that I've noticed in terms of change.
Could I just add that I was just having this conversation with one of my friends who lived in DC for a long time, and she lives a little bit like, well, in the Virginia Beach area now. She was a frequent pilot with me of mine on navigating the go-go scene. And so this was literally last week, she was asking me about go-go, and I was just like, the scene is way different. I'm like, because the city is different now. I was like, when you were here, she was living here in 2006. On any given day, we could find a place in the city to go see a go-go band. On any given day. I was like, and even further than that, on any given day, we could go. If we couldn't find one that we wanted to frequent in the city, we might find one in PG County. I was like, these days, you just gotta Google the band, find out if they have a Facebook or IG or something, and see when they're going to announce the show, because there's no venues for them. I was like, we have one right now, officially, that that's going to support the music, and that's Aqua on New York Avenue. Every other place is like, yeah, we don't know. They might allow a show at their venue, but they may not. I was like, the city is not for those places anymore. They don't make, like you said, because go-go would use a lot of warehouse type places too, but those places don't exist anymore. It's like the city is like, oh yeah, we want to be big on nightlife because we know that we have a lot of people who like to come to the city to be entertained, to go to brunch, etc., etc. But at the same time, they don't really want to cater to like the people. It's just like, oh yeah, well, we want to sell to people who are going to give us money, and then they're going to charge money to further make money for us. But you small people who just want to have a place where you can it's not, the city's not built for that anymore. And it's unfortunate because, especially in lieu of the fact that they do things like make DC hand dance the official dance of DC and make go-go the official music of DC. But then where can you do these things? People are doing it in parks because at least those are still there for the most part. But other than that, it's like the city, and you asked how has the city changed and how was the city changed around it? They're all catering to the same thing. the counties surrounding DC are trying to pull that same crowd that DC is trying to pull in to make money. They're also trying to pull that crowd out so they can make a little bit of money, but they're even also not creating those spaces where you can have like maybe a live band. I mean, there are a couple of places that will, because they just have the capacity for it. It might be a restaurant. Oh, we have a little space that we can support a band if we wanted to, or a dance floor for a dance party, but they're still not catering to the crowds of the people who really want to dance, who really want to have a space where they're comfortable to dance or to enjoy their type of entertainment. They're not doing that anymore. Unfortunately, they talk the talk like, yeah, we love it, we're welcoming it, but they're really not supporting it at all. At least that's how it's changed since 2009. 2009, we still had the space to take it and be like, hey, we're still here. Let us do our thing. Now we don't even have the space for it. And they're still pretending like, oh yeah, well, we support the movement too. But every Mochella event you see is usually outside, because where can they do a Mochella inside?
I think that's so true, and I want to just lift up two tiny things from that as well. One is that Doing It in the Park was the name of Natty Boom's DJ show on Radio CPR in honor of the wonderful Blackbird song about Rock Creek Park. And also that I love that you gave that shout out to Aqua. I remember going to balls at Aqua that would start at like 3 a.m. and you got there at 11 and it was supposed to start at 12, but it wouldn't start until 3. But I love, and these are the kind of stories and the, the histories that I think get lost without an oral history, is that was this site of these different kinds of, events and cultures coming together that you might not always, think of in the same space. I mean, it wasn't literally at the same time, but, in general. And like how that loss of space affects so many different communities in so many different ways, and how for so many communities our the importance of that public and social space. And then the last other thing I was thinking about is how the internet has also changed all of that too, because I remember having these conversations during the interviews about how Perez would ask us, our interviewer who's here, what up, Perez, great job, would ask, how did you learn about these house parties? That's another oral history project. Somebody do, please. Oral history of house parties in DC, amazing. And it was like, oh, you would run into somebody, or you'd be at a different house party and be like, oh yeah, there's another house party over there tomorrow or next weekend. And it was like always this like word of mouth thing. Whereas now it's very, I think Facebook, Instagram, they're all very helpful in their own way too, for people to create community and learn about things. But, not like word of mouth doesn't exist still, but there is a different dynamic now, I feel, in terms of how we learn and build community together.
Great, yeah, definitely seems like there are a number of kind of new oral history projects that need to be done around some of these conversations that have come out of the work that you all have done around Anthology of Booty, and I think I think that the recording of this session can be kind of a blueprint for people who might be interested in leading some of those projects, and hopefully getting support from the DC Oral History Collaborative as well. I did want to actually ask, since we do have Perez on the panel now, if you're okay with sharing, we did want to just talk a little bit more about the process and see if, as the interviewer for this project, you had any kind of tips that you might want to share to people who are thinking about starting an oral history project, possibly about the house party scene in DC and where it's come in the last 10 years. Yeah, is there anything that you want to share about the process, or any sort of challenges or any things that you felt like really worked with this project?
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me into the conversation. It's been really lovely.
I mean, first of all, to say it was it was a super big honor to be invited to like hold this process with these folks. Like I knew all of them socially, and I got to benefit from the nightlife that they created. I was at the early backdoor parties and B Bar and all these places that they're referencing. So I felt really like honored to be asked to help them kind of tell their story. And I think, yeah, there were some really unique dynamics around like how much people felt comfortable sharing about their personal lives. And one thing that's nice about oral history is that like it's a consensual process, and that we had a conversation and then people had an opportunity to say, you know what, actually that part of the conversation I don't want to include, which is really different. Like I'm a journalist, and in journalistic process, like that's not really done. And so it creates a lot more trust that people know that they can say something and then reflect on it later and decide to remove it, which happened a couple of times. So I think that's an important piece. And then I think the biggest thing for people who are considering doing the interviewing is just making sure it's a topic that you're really interested in, because that's really what's going to make the interviews enjoyable for you and for the person you're interviewing. So making sure that it's something you feel invested in, something you feel connected to, and that you have a lot of curiosity around, because that really, I mean, I really enjoyed the interviews. Like it was really fun to get to like sit down and talk to these folks who I knew, but had not necessarily heard their stories in this particular way. And it was, you know, I felt very honored that they trusted me to do that and to hold that space with them. So yeah, picking something that you feel excited about and that you feel curiosity about, and maybe some sort of connection to, you know, it's not necessarily required. And sometimes in the science of it or in like the field of it, you're supposed to pick something you have nothing to do with, because that's like you're sort of a better researcher. But I think that's kind of BS, and I prefer that people engage in these processes from the community that they're serving. So I wasn't a DJ, but I was part of the community that got to benefit from the spaces they created. And I felt like that made it a more interesting process, because I could connect to some of the things that they were saying and could ask questions that someone who didn't have any idea what it was like might not be able to ask.
Great,
I would
thanks.
even, just really quickly, I would even add to that, because but as part of a major reason why we wanted to reach out to you, not only with your experience and expertise with audio, but also because we knew if we were just talking to each other, then we would have just like missed a whole bunch of stuff. We would have had like shorthand, we would not have explained things, we would have just been like, you know, shooting the shit. But I think we all really appreciated how you brought this like extra level of reflection that, you know, where we did all know each other, but, you know, being interviewed and connecting with you, I think, at least for me, did allow me to feel like, okay, I can be a little bit more vulnerable than if it was a, you know, random person, but also like I can go into detail and like tell this story for the first time with this person I know, but like, you know, I never talked to you about like growing up in a church, but, or like why I moved to DC. And so it was really interesting and helped, at least for me, to kind of explain things in a way where I'm telling this to someone for the first time.
Yeah, totally. Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah. And I think that, you know, is a really kind of, you know, great kind of solution to what, you know, seems to be a really common problem for people who are putting together community oral history projects. You know, I do think that there's like always kind of a challenge to find that happy medium between somebody who, you know, does have a strong background with the community and with the subject, and somebody who also, you know, as you say, Ebony, isn't just going to be kind of like, you know, talking through things that everybody kind of already knows. So they're, you know, kind of taking shortcuts and not explaining things for people who might be listening to the recordings, you know, after the fact or from outside of the community. And, you know, reading through the transcripts and listening through the oral histories that you all did, you know, I think that you definitely hear that, you know, you can definitely hear that, you know, you all were able to kind of come to that kind of, you know, happy medium and that solution where, you know, everybody seems really comfortable with the interview experience, you know, especially kind of, you know, once the interviews get going after like the 20 or 30-minute mark, but, you know, everything is also kind of, you know, thoroughly on the record, I think, for people who are approaching it like me from outside of the community and, you know, not having a background in some of these things. I feel like listening to the oral histories kind of like, you know, as you're kind of going through them, you're kind of like transported to these moments and these places and everything, because you all, you know, were able to kind of be so, you know, descriptive about all of these experiences. And I think that also is a credit to Perez as an interviewer as well, to kind of like help draw these stories out of everybody that that was interviewed. So I think it's great. And, you know, Darby, again, thank you for putting that link in the chat. And I do hope that, you know, if anybody in the, you know, anybody participating has not been there to, you know, read through some of the transcripts or listen through some of the oral histories, you know, I definitely recommend doing that. I did want to ask, you know, one more question. You know, now that this project has been completed and it's in the archive, we talked about, you know, some directions that, you know, other people could kind of take, you know, some of the stories or some of the themes that have come out of the project, but are there any thoughts on kind of continuing the project, you know, either in terms of like doing more oral histories, possibly with people who experience some of the parties, some of the shows, some of the work that you all have done, or possibly even thinking about some sort of interpretive or public humanities project that uses those oral histories in some way?
Lofty goals, Jasper, lofty goals. Yes, we have this conversation every couple of months, and, you know, we'll see.
Okay.
Thank you for asking.
Sure.
We do have the conversation every couple of months, but listening back through again to the interviews really was like, oh my gosh, we need to interview this person, we need to interview that person. You know, what were they, this other person was doing this thing, that would be so curious to hear about. And I am going to put in a link here. We did, some of us did get the opportunity to also participate, not quite in an oral history project, but of a sort, with Allison Wolf, who worked with Smithsonian to do a really great panel and then some follow-up podcasts about our collective, as well as one of our Four Mothers collective, the First Ladies DJ crew. Shout out to them, amazing people. And so I think it gives some nice additional context, and then also like that would be an amazing set of people to do interviews with. But there's so much to do and so little time.
It's always the case. And it's not like you're not already busy with another oral history project, right, Darby?
Yeah, and I am doing an oral history project now. When we did ours, I was working for the government, so I couldn't do my own thing because of this project, because I couldn't get paid out of it. But now that I'm no longer there, I was able to do this project on transgender, talking with transgender elders about DC history. And it's been really insightful. I see now how much work that has put in. I knew it, but now I really, really know it. And I see also how our focus on a really limited like project, I think, or not project, you know, topic really helped, because I think mine is almost too broad. The interviews are, they you know, I've had like a couple of people I've interviewed twice of 2 hours plus each time, and there's still more we could have talked about. And so it's really figuring out the right topic seems challenging. And one thing that I did want to say that was really interesting is that I've so far, most of my interviewees are DC natives, but one of them who is not and moved here in the early 80s, everyone I'm interviewing is a transgender woman of color. She's Black. She talked about moving to DC because it was a majority Black city, because of the Black trans and gay LGBT community. And so to make that connection from this project to our project, I was just like, wow, I mean, we talk about DC that way, DC's known that way, and yet to actually hear it told in people's stories, I think is really powerful.
Are there any other, you know, kind of final comments or final thoughts, anything to wrap anything up that any of you want to share before we end?
I'd just say another tip for doing an oral history grant is it takes a lot more time than you anticipate. And so really think about massaging your time allocation, your roles allocation. And also, I just want to give a shout out to DJ D. Clark, who kept me up dancing until 2 a.m. last night. So shout out to D. Clark.
All right, well, thank you all.
I had wanted
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Kristy.
Oh, I had just wanted to also shout out some current organizers that are working on similar issues. And I don't know if other folks want to as well. Safe Spaces DC actually has a Safer Bars program where they're training staff members at bars to identify harassment and respond to it, and like have a broader shared vocabulary around like what safer spaces look like. So shout out to them. And working with community organizations has always been a part of our work, as we've talked today. So also just wanted to shout out a couple more, like the Allied Media Conference as a foundational space, BYP 100, No Justice, No Pride, and Power DC as groups in the city that are personally exciting to me and are using music in exciting ways as some of the live political work that they're doing.
Yeah, I also want to shout out Harriet's Wildest Dream. They've been organizing protests in front of Nellie's. I won't go into what happened for folks who can type that out. And just like trying to hold venues accountable around racism against patrons, against their employees, specifically anti-Blackness, and are doing lots of other organizing work around labor issues. Yeah, so.
Great. Yeah. Well, thank you all so much for, joining us today and for kind of sharing stories about sharing your stories. And I, hope that everybody will, have a chance to listen through the rest of the oral history interviews. And hopefully one day there will be that kind of next phase of the project or that interpretive piece. I know that, some of that can seem like a pretty big undertaking, but I also want to say thank you to the HDC staff, especially Tracy Mullery, who's been working behind the scenes to spotlight everybody and to make sure that this, got set up and runs smoothly. Tracy always does a really great job with that and monitoring the chat and everything. So thank you, Tracy, for that. Also want to say thank you to Rhonda and Janice for doing the ASL interpretation today. Always great to have that, and they always do such a great job as well. And also want to say thank you to the oral historians who have been such a big part of the DC Oral History Collaborative and shaping it, such as Anna Kaplan and Maggie Lemire and Benji De La Piedra. And then I just want to, kind of put in a plug for next month's Oral History Coffee Chat next month. On August 28th, we'll have an Oral History Coffee Chat featuring Mara Cherkasky and Sarah Schoenfeld, who do a project called Mapping Segregation. And this time, for real, in 2017, they did an oral history project related to mapping segregation that focused on school desegregation in Ward 4. So it'll be a really great program, and I hope that everybody can join us for that as well. And just the last thing, Tracy has put in the chat the link for the next month's program, but also a link to a survey. And if you could just fill that out for us, it only takes a few seconds. It just helps us get a little bit of feedback on the program and know how we can improve and continue to do this, better and better each month. So if you could fill that out, that would be really great. So with that, that's it. And thank you all for joining us all the attendees, all the panelists. It's been a really great program, and I really appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.